a decent amount of time, or at least I did, talking about Counter-Strike in the panel. And I think this will be focused more towards League of Legends. So those of you who are looking forward to kind of league specific, how to use data, will be sure be a good talk to stick around here, guys. So what's the agenda? Well, we're going to provide a little bit more insight into what is EG. We will kind of briefly intro myself and Zach again, just for new folks that are here for the presentation that weren't here for the panel. We'll talk about how our specific team operates and as far as gaming analytics goes. And then we'll jump into kind of data specific things. So what do you need to actually do to be a good data scientist? Remember I said we'll talk more about that. That'll be section 4, thinking like a pro. And then finally, how do we use data to actually support our coaching staff and our players? We'll walk through that as well for some specific examples. So without further ado.
Cool, thanks Soham. So everyone probably knows what Evil Geniuses is because you're all here, but we're gonna have this slide anyways, just in case you don't. So Evil Geniuses is one of the oldest esports organizations in North America. We have teams that compete competitively in League, Dota 2, Valorant, CSGO, FGC, as well as streamers who stream various titles on platforms like Twitch. And so Soham and I are on our technology team, and we work on problems in the space and using data and technology to help people do their job and help our teams win more, basically. So again, brief introductions. I think everyone, again, just listened to us talk for an hour, but whatever. I'm Zach Cameron. I'm head of technology at Evil Geniuses, so I lead the technology team. And background, I started my career working in soccer analytics for a Premier League club in England, as well as a club in Ireland. From there, I moved into the finance space in trading and early stage investments, and then joined DG in January of 2020, where I started working on using technology and data in the esports space in both the gaming side as well as the business side. And we'll hand it over to Soham to give an intro.
What's up, guys? Soham here again. And I think in the panel, I talked a little bit about kind of education and Tesla. So here I'll talk about my background after Tesla was actually working at Google. And there I did a lot of actual business intelligence stuff and trying to think about what these objectives that we were talking about in the panel, how should they be created, right? From both the BI perspective, but also anything. Because how do you determine how you measure success? What does good look like? And I spent a lot of time understanding that at Google, obviously surrounded by a bunch of smart people there, and just try to take in as much as possible. So that influenced kind of my trajectory of when I got into esports in C9, TSM, EG. How do I use those kinds of insights and asking the right questions to be a better data scientist in the space, right? So I think that's me, engineering background, worked at Tesla and Google, esports, professional player, coach, and here we are today kind of doing what I think is the best of all worlds for me. This is really my passion here, bridging kind of esports, data science, my background, asking questions, boring people, pissing people off. I think all of that put together is kind of my personality. So I hope you guys get to see that a little bit more. And with that, you guys know who we are. So back to you, Zach.
Yeah, so let's dive in and let's go to an example in League of Legends, the game we've all been waiting to talk about. So here is some dots that are certainly not to scale, but I'll sort of explain what they mean in a second. So on the right is a dot representing all the LCS pro play, right? So each year in LCS, there's about 1,500 games, give or take, like probably a pretty good bit, but anyways, let's just use 1,500. No one go check because that number is definitely a little off. And then in all Riot Pro Leagues, right, there's about 5,000 in a year, give or take, again, maybe like a couple thousand. Depends on the year, depends on the setup, but whatever. And then let's look at solo queue, right? So just casual play, you and me playing. There's over 5 million matches played every single day. And so the reason I'm giving this example is because when you look at LCS Pro Play, you say there's 1,500 games. Okay, you can hire, 3 coaches or analysts, and they can maybe like watch all of them, take notes on all of them, do pretty deep analysis on all of those games and all of those players. Like it won't be super fun because, that's like a lot of gameplay to watch and it'd be like the only thing they were doing, but it's possible to do in a year, and people certainly do that, to be clear. But then we zoom out a little bit, right, and we look at all Riot Pro leagues, and you start getting to a bigger number, and you have, give or take a few thousand, 5,000. It becomes a bit more intractable, right? You're getting to numbers where there's just literally not that many hours in a year. And so you're starting to pick and choose, right? Okay, we're only going to watch this league because we care about this league more. And we're only going to watch these games because we think they're the most interesting ones, right? So maybe that's fine, right? Maybe there's certain leagues you just really don't care about. But, you're missing things. Like it's not debatable. You're not watching all the games. There's some things that you're not seeing. But then we zoom out a bit more and we look at solo queue, right? 5 million per day. Everyone here knows like most of those are people like me who are playing, who no pro coach cares about my game literally at all. But there's still, thousands of games every day being played by people who could be pro quality at some point in the future. But we have no, first of all, there's no way to even watch them. Second of all, even if you could watch them, so you had a stream available for all of them, it's not physically feasible. There's too many matches. And so, our answer to all of this is, instead of looking at the games like just videos that we can watch, let's use analytics, right? That's what analytics is for. It's for taking big data sets and drawing conclusions from them. And so we break gaming analytics down into these 4 categories. So the first is reducing manual work. So this is all the things that you can imagine a player, a coach, someone on our esports team would be doing that's manual. So, maybe people are manually looking through Liquipedia drafts and they're trying to figure out, what does Cloud9 draft most frequently? And it's kind of manual. Maybe they're annotating manually, what happens at certain points in the game. Can we use technology to automate that and allow them to focus on what actually matters rather than writing stuff down in Excel spreadsheets, because that's not what matters. The second is data-driven strategy, which I think is what comes to a lot of people's head when they think about esports. And that's, right, can we help make better decisions in game using data? So, for example, should I go take the dragon right now in League of Legends? I'm sure if you asked a player or a coach at a certain point in the game, they would tell you yes or no. It makes sense. It doesn't make sense. But can we use data to make their decisions that tiny bit better so that, we have an edge? The third is scouting. So this sort of gets back to the example I just gave of, can we use data to find the best players in the world and turn them into champions? And then the fourth is data-driven coaching. So can we use data to help our coaches be better coaches, give better advice, understand more where areas of improvement are? And I asked that as a question. I think for all of these, the answer is yes, we can. And yes, at EG, we do these things. And so to us, right, a lot of people see video. We don't just see video, we see video and we see a huge data set that we can do cool stuff with and ask interesting questions about. But with that, there are lots and lots and lots of questions that come to mind when you think about things to do with this data set. And we don't have endless amounts of resources, sadly, just yet. Maybe someday in the future, we'll see. And so one of the big things we have to struggle with is, how do we decide what to work on? And so we break this down into a couple key things. And the first is data availability. So, do we have the data easily accessible already? Is it even possible to get the data? So for example, maybe we want to do something with eye tracking. Well, do we have that data already? No. If not, how long is it going to take us to get it? Is it even possible? There, all these things to consider. The second is ability to execute. And so this is sort of, there's a lot of questions out there that we know are maybe possible to answer, but there's some questions that we have that we're like, not actually sure if there's an easy way to answer them, or if, we can answer them in a reasonable amount of time because of how complex they are. And so we want to work on problems that we know we can execute on and deliver value. The second, or the third is sort of what we think of as replay value, which is, okay, we're building this thing. Is it going to be useful for more than just this one time? Is it going to be useful in the future? Can we continue to build other things on top of it? And then these all come together into this nice triangle chart into business value, right? So in the end, what we really want to do is just build things that are the most valuable in the quickest amount of time. And these are how we measure that. And so the way we really think of this long term is, rather than building a car a piece at a time, so rather than building a wheel and then maybe an axle and another wheel, and then you have a car body, we want to build a vehicle that gets better and better. Because if I give you a wheel, maybe I'm a data scientist and I'm like, look, this model's super cool. And the person's going to say, that's a cool model, but it's useless because, it doesn't really give me anything. So rather than just giving a model that's not valuable yet, but maybe in some time period in the future will be valuable once it's finally a car, we want to build a skateboard, which, right, our coach might say, this is a skateboard. It's not even a boosted board. Like, it's like manual drive skateboard. This is pretty mediocre, but it's better than nothing, right? And it's still usable. And then from there, right, we can maybe we add a battery pack to the skateboard, and then it can go 25 miles an hour. And then before you know it, right, you have a Ferrari, or you have a Tesla. And that's sort of the way we work as a team, is incrementally building better and better products for our coaches to use. And that can go a long way. And so I'm going to hand it over to Soham now, who's going to talk a bit more in depth through some examples of work we've done, and he has done, and how they apply to League of Legends in particular.
All right. That was great. I think what Zach talked about, by the way, in terms of you kind of want to have something to show and also get feedback on every single step of the way, I think is super important, because without that collaborative kind of mindset, you're just kind of tunnel vision and you're working in an island, in a silo, and that's not useful for anyone, right? So I think with that in mind, I mean, this first slide kind of is what does it take to actually be a great esports data scientist, right? The first thing you have to do is be able to think like a pro player, pro coach, whatever it is. So I'm going to walk through a couple of these pictures here. So on the left here, it's obviously an upside down pyramid at a famous museum in France, right? And I think the approach that a lot of players and people actually take to learning in general is like this bottom up and top down approach. So there's two types of ways you can learn. According to psychologists, it's top down learning and bottom up learning. So I'll give you an example for that. So the second picture of this AK-47, it's in Counter-Strike. I know it's a League of Legends talk, but for the purpose of this example, this works pretty well. If your goal as a player was to figure out how to control the recoil on this gun, and you're a top-down learner, what you would do is you would hop into the game and just start playing and just start figuring it out, learn by doing. So top-down learning is a lot of learning by doing, learning by watching other people do the same thing, and just getting better through experience. So that's top-down, right? And bottom-up learning, in contrast, is before you even hop in the server, hop in the game, you're trying to understand how to control the recoil. What's the first thing you should think about? Maybe I should think about how I should hold my mouse. Those are the grips, right? On the third picture. Maybe I should think about what type of mouse I should get as a player. If I'm someone that has a lot of muscles, which I'm not, I might get a heavier mouse. If I'm someone that is kind of weak, maybe I should get a light mouse, right? If I move my mouse really fast, I have a high sensitivity, maybe I should get a sensor that can handle that, right? And you think of all the individual pieces that would make you a better player that is able to control recoil if you're a bottom-up learner. You actually learn and try to master all the individual pieces before you actually become a player in the server trying to do this thing, which in this case is control the recoil. So that's the difference between top-down and bottom-up learning. Top-down, you learn by doing. Bottom-up, you basically try to think about all the different pieces first and then try to do that thing, right? So I think with that in mind, I think which type of learning is actually better to becoming a professional, whether that's a coach or a player? As we walk through the next few slides, we'll actually answer that question. And the answer, I think, is probably something you guys will find useful, not just in playing, but also just, I think, how you should approach thinking and learning in life in general is a good way to approach it, in my opinion. And so with that, let's actually move on to kind of how we actually use data. First, we'll talk about coaching. So if I'm a coach and if I'm trying to think like a coach, the first thing I need to think about is there's two main questions. What do I need to know if I'm prepping for a match coming up this weekend for the LCS, let's say, right? What do I need to know as a coach? That's the first thing. And the second thing is, what do players need to know, right? So I think those two distinctions are super important because there are going to be times during practice that you need to know more than players so you can help adjust, help correct during the review session, etc. And for games that are best of 3, best of 5 in League of Legends, where you can talk as a coach between the games to your players, you also need to know more than the players in terms of overall strategy. So you can give the advice based on how the game has been going. The players, on the other hand, should be focusing on playing, basically doing the thing that they've been doing countless thousands of hours, be as automatic as possible, and use their intuition and their instinct, obviously with some insights, right? But at the end of the day, they're players and they want to be able to perform at their best, right? So with this, I think coaches really need to keep track of 3 main things when it comes to preparation for practice and also for matches. The first thing is, what have you been doing well? That's this balancing act, right? Is what have we been doing well as a team, and how can we nudge games towards these scenarios? First thing. The second thing is, what can we do well most of the time, but sometimes we forget. So we need to encourage players and remind them to do these things better. And finally, what are things that we don't do well at all, and how do we avoid getting into these scenarios in the match? See, this third point, this area of improvements point, it's obviously super important in terms of practice because you want to get better at those areas, right? But when it comes to a match time, you have this list, you have these 3 points, you want to approach the match in a way that you're optimizing your chance of winning. So you don't want to be focusing on, oh, maybe we should play the right way 100% of the time here. If you don't do certain things well as a coach, you should just try not to get in those situations, right? So this is thinking like a coach. So these 3 lines of understanding kind of impact, obviously, how coaches approach strategy, how do they talk to players. So naturally, as the data scientist in an esports team, you want to try to use data to help support these 3 lines of understanding, right? So with that, we'll talk about a very specific match and show you how a coach might use data that we provide. So what are we looking at here, right? The first thing is, this is a match that was played recently, Cloud9 versus PSG Talon. I think I'm picking on Cloud9 a little too much maybe, but maybe they deserve it, right? So this is from a match a few days ago, MSI Rumble Stage Day 2, C9, like I said, versus PSG Talon. And what you're seeing on the chart is basically on the left axis is win probability. And this is a model that we've created to predict win probability in real time at any given point of a game. Okay, so that's the graph that you see that are connected with these white lines. You see the yellow circles, green circles, orange circles leading down to the red circles. That's the win probability chart. And the higher up on the chart you are, the more likely it is that Cloud9 is going to win at that point. The x-axis is the game time. And the lower you are is more likely for PSG Talon to win. So that's the first y-axis on the left, win probability. The right side axis is goal difference, and that's the bright blue circles and the bright red circles with the dotted white line kind of representing 0 gold difference. So this is gold lead. If you're bright blue, then C9 is in the lead in terms of gold. If you're bright red, then PSG is in the lead in terms of gold. The first thing you should notice when you're comparing these two charts in the same graph here is it almost looks like gold difference, which is a very basically available data stat that you can get. You can go to the match history page, Wikipedia. In general, this is very easy to get. You write API, whatever it is. This is not a model, right? Gold difference is just a calculation. This looks almost like a lagged version, shifted to the right of the win probability chart. And we'll focus on kind of these two distinct points of this chart, this 20-minute point where if you look at the gold difference chart, you see the gold lead going from Cloud9 to PSG. That's the first instance where that gold lead change happens from the gold perspective. Whereas in the win probability chart, the first time that Cloud9 goes and dips below 50% win probability, it seems to be at like this 15, 16-minute range. So there's two distinct points of view here in the game that we want to take a look at. From a, let me go back a little bit. From like a perspective of how do you build a win probability model? The technical question on how we built this, if you guys have questions, feel free to ask that at the end. But I'll give a brief kind of overall viewpoint of that. The basic point is that we're taking into consideration how the game got to the point that we're at. So if you're trying to calculate at 10 minutes, if you look at this chart, looks like C9's at about maybe a 70% win probability. We're taking into account actually the first 10 minutes completely to predict the win probability at that 10th minute mark. It's a rolling kind of moving forward win probability calculator that takes into account the time ordered sequence of events. And when we say events, these are things that EG derives ourselves, things like we detect team fights, obviously dragon kills, champ kills, deaths, total team damage, the gold lead as well, overall health remaining on a team, bunch of different metrics. There's like 40 or 50 that we take into account that feed into this win probability calculator. The point is it takes into account how the game progressed to the current game state and predicts the win probability at that game state based on all the previous information up until then, right? Okay, with that being said, a lot of mumbo jumbo. Does this actually reflect what happened in the game? And I think this is the coolest part and how coaches can actually use this information. So I'm gonna talk over this clip. I'll set some context. This is remember I said there's two distinct points of the game that were important here. The first one, this is the one that I remember casters on social media were talking about a lot as the reason that C9 lost. And it was when PSG was going for Baron and they got basically, C9 applied a little bit of pressure, so PSG had to come off the Baron, and I'm gonna play from this point. You'll notice that Blabber, for some reason, sticks around, overextends, and gets caught out right here, and PSG kills him, which leads into this enormous team fight that PSG just crushes Cloud9 in, right? So you can see this play out. They basically kill everyone on C9's team that was in this range of the team fight. Now, I'm gonna pause it here for a sec, and I'll just talk about, let's look at the top stats, the basic stats that are always displayed you can look at, right? So before this happened, C9 was actually in the lead. Now, obviously, we have PSG, more kills, more gold, more towers, more dragons, everything. So this is the moment, if you look at the bottom left graph, the win probability, the red circled area, that's the point that we're talking about here. C9 was already going to be losing, and now it really, there's no recovery here. But C9 was already going to be losing. But all the social media and most of the people put all the blame on Blabber for this game because of that overextension up there and dying. So what about our win probability calculator? What does that say about what was the most important point of the game? And that's where we talk about this 15 to 16 minute range. So here in this clip, I'll set the table again. We're 16 minutes in. C9 is up in gold. You can see that up by 1,400, up a kill. PSG does have more dragons, but overall C9 is in a pretty good stage. There's just been some farming going around, some team fights have happened obviously, but now C9 is going to be just getting the Herald here, so I'll play it. So C9, they killed the Herald. and things are great. Life is good. After the most people, they're teleporting back to base, and suddenly you'll notice the cameraman sees Sven is just out in the open, and he gets caught out by PSG. So Sven gives up this death in an isolated area of the map, zero potential to trade. And this is actually what our calculator picked up as the most important point of the game in terms of swinging the momentum from one team to another. And again, that's the left circle here, taking C9, who was in the lead, and suddenly there's a huge dip here because of this one death that Sven gave up. And guess what? He died in the same exact way that Blabber did, right? Which was he was away from the team, he stuck around, he got caught out, but no one was talking about it. You know, I went back and I looked, Reddit, social media, casting even. No one really pointed to this understated moment of the game, seemingly as a swing moment. And I found that super interesting because obviously coaches are humans, players are humans. When we're looking at reviewing VODs and matches, let's say we're preparing, we look at the C9 match, we're also going to remember the highlight reel moments, which was the previous clip I showed you guys, where huge team fight win by PSG, Blabber gets caught out, all the blame is on Blabber. What is he doing? Replace him ASAP, like all those comments that come up, right? Well, here we're showing Sven gets caught out in the same exact way, and it actually is the beginning of this dip, and C9 never recovers from here. And I think this is something to keep in mind. Coaches, what we want to do is help uncover insights for coaches and aid them in being able to detect when did things start to go wrong? Why did they go wrong? Let's go take a deeper look. And this is one approach, using these win probability modeling calculators to kind of help uncover that. So that's the first kind of how do we use data to actually help coaches. Okay. And that's great. So this is, we're helping coaches here. We're using data. This is all good stuff. What about the players? This is a little bit less fancy, but I think actually this might be the most kind of useful slide in the presentation in terms of how should you be going about being a better player and using data and thinking about using data to be a good esports data scientist. And here's how. So the main thing that players generally need help with is asking better questions, because they're already really great at actually mechanically playing the game. I mean, that's how they got to becoming a pro, right? So we want to be using data to help ask better questions. So let's look at the kind of the middle here. The first question, let's say C9, let's say EG is playing Team Liquid this weekend on the LCS. Something that you might ask as a player is, how do we want to play against Team Liquid? Let's think about the scrims we played against them, previous matches, how Liquid's been playing. How should we play against Team Liquid? Seems like a good question. It is a good question. But a better question might be, how do you play against teams when they are playing like Team Liquid? We're generalizing. We're moving up. We're starting at the bottom of this hierarchy, and we're generalizing up, right? Bottom up. So maybe a better question even from that is, what does a good play look like, and what does like Liquid entail? So again, we're generalizing up. We start at the bottom is, how do you play against Team Liquid specifically? Then you go one level up. You can keep going up. And this is this bottom up learning that I talked about previously that allows you to start at kind of the most distinct, separate questions, as situational as possible, that you might start at as a player thinking about the game, and you keep working your way up and generalize. Well, why would you generalize? That's obviously like why is bottom up good here? Why is it better generalized? Well, if you're a player and you're on stage, you need to perform well, and you're thinking about, as the game is happening and unfolding, you're thinking about all these exact situations. Maybe you've seen this exact thing that has happened before. Do you do the calculations in real time, or do you just play the game? Should you just be using your instincts and try to automate your movements as much as possible and just do what you're best at? You've done these motions thousands of times. Why spend time just thinking about things that will just clutter your ability to play? So being able to generalize as a player is hugely important, and using data to help uncover how do you move up from these situational scenarios up to generalizing, so you can remember generalized information and apply it over a large chunk of different teams and quickly as well within a game is hugely important here. So that was the bottom up approach, right? Starting at the bottom of the hierarchy, moving up. The top down context that we need to add on to this is, well, what is good and what is bad? So it's great if you know everything, like all the plays that are good and are bad, so you can actually assign these different situations you experience in practice to these good, bad clusters. You know, how you take how you take the first dragon, how do you counter against the first dragon? Maybe these are like the high level clusters you're talking about here. Well, you need to know what good and bad actually is. How do you know if a scenario is like another one? If Team Liquid did that to you in practice today, how do you associate what you experienced today with what you experienced against other teams in the previous days of practice on stage before? How do you associate these clusters of scenarios together, right? If a team loses, does that mean that they didn't do anything that was good? If a team wins, does that mean everything that they did was perfect? I mean, these are rhetorical questions, but in a way, you need to double down and help players and coaches understand that there is something to learn at this level, especially semi-pro and pro, from every single game, whether it was won or lost. And the best way to do that is use data to help cluster these different scenarios into like these generalized clusters as you move up this hierarchy. So in terms of data in League of Legends, how do you do that, right? Like this is a theoretical step here, but the next step, I want you guys to think about basically each row here. These are intentionally vague. I numbered these clusters from 0 to 3, but every row here, think of it as a group and cluster of plays. So maybe cluster 1 is, how do you take, what is the setup that leads to taking first dragon? All the setups, all the plays that require, that you've seen historically with data that lead to a first dragon maneuver or a dive in the bot lane or any different types of situations you might think. All the situations that led to a first blood at the top lane. Like anything you can think of, these are clusters that arise just naturally based on important things that happen in the game. How do you come up with what these clusters mean? Well, that's the part where you need to kind of collaborate with subject matter experts, coaches, players. The machine, the data gets you so far in terms of it's really good at automating and correlating what all these different types of plays, which ones are connected to each other, which ones should be in this cluster 1 or cluster 2. That it's great at doing. What it cannot do is actually automatically tell you what each cluster represents. See, at the end of, let's say, a clustering technique, you won't know that 1 might mean all these first dragon setups. You might not know that 2 actually is all the plays that led to an early gold lead at the 5th minute, at the 10th minute. You might not know that. The computer doesn't know that. If you look at now all the information, all the scenarios that it did group though, and you go through a few of them, this is when you use the human element, the subject matter expertise that you have in coaches, players, yourself as someone who plays the game, to assign labels to these clusters. So this is, again, the mishmash of top-down learning with bottom-up learning. Clustering by itself is a very bottom-up approach, right? But then you can assign this context on top. And that's what this kind of combination approach allows you to do with the data, with your coaches and your players. And what we do at EG is use tools like this to help put the spotlight on extracting out patterns from matches that have happened recently, from practice recently, from basically trying to understand what the meta is. So meta, I'm sure most of you guys know, but it just stands for meta game, which helps you kind of, the meta basically means what is currently being done with high value in terms of game strategy that you should try to replicate or at least understand. And usually different regions, so North America has a different meta than Europe, than Korea, than different APAC regions, Oceania, etc. And some people argue one is better than the other. The important thing is that they all exist, and we all need to be able to identify them and know how to play against them. And that's what this kind of clustering analysis helps with. So we can recommend kind of when situations arise in a game, we can now quickly identify, okay, how do you counter the first dragon setups? How do you prevent that first blood from happening at the top lane? How do you prevent your bot lane from getting dove on? I think dove. I was going to say divin, which makes zero sense. So these are the types of, see, we're asking questions. Data helps you ask better questions, right? And that's the whole approach here, is we want to be helping our players and our coaches ask better questions and then use data to answer them or help answer them. And I think that's the point of this. Heat maps like these, for example, which we're trying to group play styles into different clusters, they basically just significantly reduce the time of manual effort that would go into doing this, by yourself as a coach, right? Being able to have a machine do it for you, and then you can get the benefit of extracting insights and labeling it yourself. It just saves a lot of time. It's not like humans couldn't do this. It's intractable if you're trying to do this across many different matches, many different teams, many different regions, right? And those are generally, by the way, the best cases, the best use cases for using data, machine learning, different statistical techniques is when a human can do something really well, but it's just impossible to do it at a large scale. That's when you should use machine learning. And in general, like, don't just try to use machine learning for everything. It's almost like it's a hammer, and sometimes you do have nails, but sometimes you have screws, right? You don't want to just hammer a screw into a wall. You should be using a screwdriver. Maybe that's a regression. Maybe that's just plotting something and seeing what the correlation looks like. It could be basic stuff. My point is machine learning, a good rule of thumb, comes into play, and clustering obviously is a form of machine learning, is when a human can do these things really well, but you would just need a lot of them and a lot of man hours to do it over large data sets. That is a good application of machine learning. So, this is a good point. We're about 40 minutes in. We've checked out a few different ways that the tech team and data scientists in esports can help our esports teams, players, coaches with analytics. And I think this is a good point for us to kind of open up the floor to questions. And I'm sure you guys understood everything we said perfectly, so there's probably no questions. But if you guys do, this is the time. And obviously we would like to thank everyone for attending, Chris and Sean for obviously hosting and being great moderators. And we'd love to hear whatever we can answer from you guys.
Absolutely. I mean, Zach, Soham, I'm speechless. What a phenomenal presentation. I feel like so much insight, definitely for myself, Sean, also all the other attendees here. We'll dive into a lot of the fantastic questions that everyone's asking. First one's from Akshay regarding the win percentage model. He wants to know, is it running in real time, sort of taking in the data in as the game plays, or is it run after the game by, inputting a VOD or some other data set post-match?
Yeah, good. Great question. It is done effectively. You could do it in either way. I think specifically the way we have it set up is as games complete, we are looking into it. But if we ever wanted to do it in real time and basically doing it as data is coming in, we could do it as well. That's what it's meant to do. It's taking in information up until the game state that you're at to predict that next win probability. So that's exactly what it's meant to do in real time.
And for our next question from David, when looking at the causes for drop in win probability, do you have calculated variable importance, or do you correlate the graph with the events in the game like you went over in your presentation?
Yeah, it's both. I think there's so many metrics that are involved here that the game state. I mean, basically think of something like even position on the map across the 10 players. That's a huge level of information that is utilized in determining how much map control each side has, blue versus red side. Just the fact that you're blue or red side, that impacts your chance to win, right? So it's like every metric that you can possibly think of and more, because EG derives a lot of custom metrics as well, we utilize in terms of deciding what this model is being, how it's utilizing these metrics to punch out what the win probability is for each side.
Awesome. Thank you. We've got another question from Clayton. Zach, we'll start with you, and then Soham, feel free to tack on anything after that. So I'm going to talk about the model. Can you sort of generalize this type of thing and answer the question, how can we play like teams like RNG or Damwon? Or in other words, how do we automatically determine what are unique characteristics of those successful teams play?
Yeah, so I think this was from the clustering portion of the talk. And the answer is yes, you definitely can, and that's definitely a thing that it can be used for. And so I'll give a couple examples. One, going back to when I used to do soccer analytics, is a thing coaches would ask for all of the time was, I want Cristiano Ronaldo on my team, but I can't afford Cristiano Ronaldo. Can you find me players who look like Cristiano Ronaldo but don't cost $300 million, right? And so that's definitely a thing that you can do, and you know, we have done before. I would say generally we don't do that a huge amount, but it can be useful for just sort of like thinking about the problem space of, hey, there's a team, what are unique characteristics to them, by looking at the characteristics that fall into that cluster that they fall into. So I don't know if Soham, you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I think that is the great, like the quintessential use case of clustering is being able to generalize playstyles. I think it's, if people are using clustering in this way in esports, then it is almost the first thing you should do, right? Is you want to be able to determine what are similar plays, and you know, breaking it down, RNG might have those specific plays, but really what we care about is abstracting out that it's RNG and just looking at what plays that they have done that have returned value. Remember, going back to the objectives we've talked about in the panel. So how do we determine what plays we even care about? I mean, that's a question I didn't go into, because by nature, clustering is unsupervised, meaning that there is no objective you care about, but the metrics you define a cluster based off of, like, you know, we had 0, 1, 2, 3 as the cluster labels, but what do those represent? You definitely should be thinking about objectives when it comes to that. Meaning the fact that I said that a cluster that's important is getting the first kill. It just makes sense, right? But what is another objective? Getting the first tower, maybe getting the first dragon, maybe being up in gold if you have a specific team composition. Because being up in gold at 10 minutes isn't always the best metric. Because if you're up by gold by X, but your team composition really says on average you should be up by 2X, it doesn't matter that your gold lead is X. It should be 2X. So you're actually underperforming. So these are the ways you should define what those clusters actually are and generalize again. And of course, at the end, should you tack this back to the fact that it's RNG that these plays came from? So then when you play against RNG, you have a kind of an approach to play against them, know what to expect, of course. But that's the easy part. The hard part is to extract out what plays you care about and then just get them from different teams.
Yeah, thank you so much. So for the next question, how can data scientists use the top-down approach that we mentioned at the beginning compared to the bottom-up that we dove into a lot during the presentation?
Great question. I think these are fancy phrases, guys, but the important thing to know is top-down means that you're just learning through experience, right? And in this case, as a data scientist, and really anyone who's looking at statistics, what is the first thing you should do when you get a data set? You should just plot it. Just plot some random stuff. Just try to understand, is there a relationship here worth exploring? Oh, maybe I should, there's no real relationship in the raw data set. Maybe I should normalize some values, some columns, plot it again. See, this is top down in the sense, I'm not actually understanding what I'm looking at yet. I'm exploring the data, and top down again, learn by doing, right? You figure out by looking at maybe sports analytics, maybe other esports analytics, the different techniques and the different visualizations that are done, and you just try to do it again. You're just kind of using your different experiences and like tools you have at your disposal just to see what happens, explore the data. And I think that is the top-down approach for data scientists.
Awesome. I think there's definitely a lot of valid approaches to both, and I think they're both very useful. Another question, which we'll start off with Zach, from Matthew. He says, how do you work around small data sets and gather information with high uncertainty? As you mentioned, sort of that league game disparity between LCS and regular. Furthermore, what do you consider small in the first place?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think this is something you see in any space where you're trying to analyze data in some way, right? If you have like the quintessential example is like, let's look at the US presidential election. Like, is the prediction wrong because the thing with 70% probability is not what happens? Like, you don't know because there's only a sample of one. Like things like that can certainly happen in league as well. And so, there's techniques to get around that. I think clustering is one of them. Things like PCA is another one where, maybe you have, 200 champions in League of Legends that you care about. That number might be wrong, but whatever. Can you group them into, instead of 200, 10 or 20 so that you sort of decrease the dimensionality of your data set? And there's things like that you can do to get around these problems. And I think someone else asked a question around patch changes and how much does that affect it? Because again, right, every patch there's things changing and your data set is, maybe you think of it as your data set is new every 3 weeks, which of course would be problematic. And so, yeah, long story short, it's definitely something you have to think about, but there are ways to get around it. And then the second part of the question, which was what is small? I don't know that I really have a good answer to that. I think like, yeah, I don't actually know if I have a good answer to that one. Maybe Soham does.
I think a great example of what is small are patch changes, because every time a patch gets, every time you have a new patch, you have a way smaller data set. Matches have not yet been played in some cases ever, right? On that patch, you do have solo queue data though, and you do have solo queue data at different ranks. Is it a great proxy for how professionals play? Obviously, through experience, I know the answer is no. I think there are things you can take away from solo queue in terms of what you can actually take back to your team and say, this is some insights that are worth using, even though pros have not yet played on a patch. I'll give you an example. So what would stay the same between solo queue, which you do have a lot of data for almost instantly, as soon as a patch changes, you still have millions of people playing the game, right? So you have instantly a lot of data for the new patch. What you can take from that is a champion being used in a way that we haven't seen before, right? Maybe that means in this week of practice, guys, Sven Skaren, you should try out this champion that's being used more in the jungle, right? I think champion usage are some giving more damage output than another now. Just analyzing the actual patch, the stats that are related to the patch changes. Riot has something called the Data Dragon, which is basically a publicly available set of assets that just tell you all the different stats for every champion, like the base stats, how do the items interact with the champions, and just in general, what do the items do, any other base level changes, stat related changes. If all you did as a small project was to analyze the Data Dragon from patch to patch and understand what you should be putting a closer eye to, because this is different, that's something I don't think half the esports teams even do, right? I'm obviously guessing here, but the reason is like these analysis are not rudimentary and they're also not super obvious to do. And even if you do them, you might not be able to get a professional player or a coach to implement them. So there is some culture setting involved here, right? Is this worth trying out? Is this worth, even if the data says so? So I think these are all interesting questions that kind of fall into other kind of tangential areas. But in a way, yeah, what is small and like how can you counteract that? I mean, if there is data for it that you can make kind of correlations from and extract, interpolate from, you can become from small a larger kind of data set, right?
Thank you, Soham. And for our next question from Tanner, hierarchical clustering is something that I've run into major computational power issues in the past to run it successfully. How does your team handle big data challenges? Is through the use of Spark or parallelization? If you want to start out with Zach.
Yeah, I can take that. I mean, with the cloud these days, basically there's two things. One is you can spin up a massive, instance with the click of a button, which is pretty amazing. And there's another insight, which is, basically purchasing an instance in the cloud with 1 GB of memory and 1 CPU for an hour costs the same as purchasing, an instance with 60 vCPUs and 60 GB of memory for a minute, which you can take advantage of to make things happen quicker. You brought up Spark, and yes, you can use Spark and you can use, clusters of computers when you have really, really big data sets to do hierarchical clustering. I think Spark has clustering libraries built into its data science packages. So.
Awesome. And another question for either of you from Rishi. Since we talked a little bit about how the model that you guys built is sort of post-match, right? In your guys' opinion, is there a place for live data science results in matches? He gave the context about something like CS, where coaches can communicate with players live during the match or something like that. Soham, if you can start us off.
I've been suggesting that for a long time in Counter-Strike tournaments and also League of Legends. Some of that is kind of up to the tournament organizer, right? Because in the beginning of Counter-Strike, for example, coaches could just talk at any point, like literally at any point. It's kind of like being on the sidelines of like a basketball game. You can just yell stuff out, right? And that's how it was in Counter-Strike for a long time. Valve had a problem with that because you essentially are making a 5 versus 5 game into a 6 versus 6, or even sometimes a 6 versus 5 if another team doesn't have a coach. Not every team had coaches. So they didn't want that. Counter-Strike was supposed to be a 5 versus 5 game. So then they instilled some, restrictions. Coaches can then take 2 timeouts per half and things like that. In Riot, in League of Legends, as you guys have seen, coaches are not allowed on stage at all. Only between games can you interact between coaches and players. I think it's similar in Dota as well. So in terms of live data science results, getting as close to real time as possible is definitely better than not, because even if you can only talk with players between these breaks, you need to be able to analyze that game that just happened, right? And of course you can do that manually because you're watching, but if you had these insights we've talked about here, maybe these win probability graphs, a lot of things we didn't talk about, these clustering, hey, they're playing more like these types of, it looks like they're playing this aggressive early game play style, and they chose a champion pool that said that they should be really playing for late game. They're doing different things here, guys. Like they're playing different than normal. Like these kinds of things, I think if you had like a quick scouting report in a way for teams available for these live data science results, there's definitely space for it. I think to be able to implement it though, I think it is a little bit up to the tournament organizers, how much flexibility they give to each team and coaches.
It's definitely interesting insight coming from someone who is both a player and a coach and has had success with both. And for our next question coming from Clayton, how do you encode a play as a vector so that you can even apply a clustering algorithm? If you want to start with Soham.
Sure, great question. I like that these are getting more and more technical, which means that we're gonna have a whole host of new esports data scientists soon, right, guys? That's what that means. So in general, I think what you need is you have different types of data in every game. You have events, and then you have snapshots that you can get, whatever it is, every X seconds, every X minutes, whatever that granularity is, and you need to combine them. So events are things like if a kill happens, that's an event. If the bomb is defused in Counter-Strike, that's an event. If you basic in League of Legends, for example, if you take down a tower, that's an event. See, these are events that are obvious. We can actually define events ourselves that we know are important. I'll give you an example. When you take map control in Counter-Strike, that's not an event that you're going to get from the Valve APIs or the game data from directly, is what I'm saying. That's not an event that's going to be captured from just the data directly. We're defining that. We control how that is defined, meaning if you take control of these coordinates of the map, then we know you've taken map control and you haven't taken any damage. There's no damage exchanges. You have this for an X amount of time. Okay, you have map control of this area, right? We are defining those events. We have the positional data, which are the coordinates of every player in the server live in League of Legends and Counter-Strike and whatever else game. We have positional data and we have event data. We correlate the two, we collate the two, and then we have a good picture. This basically this vector is starting to form now. You can see, right? You have timeline data, which is once every whatever minute, second, and then you also have these events that come from the game naturally. You have these events that you've custom defined, and all of that together help you define this, what an event, what a play, what a scenario might be.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Soham. And unfortunately, we're running out of time. So just one last question for you both. Zach, we can start with you. As data science and these techniques get more and more popular, and we sort of touched on this in the initial Q&A, how do you guys deal with, interpretability and transparency of these models that you build?
Sure, that's a good question. I mean, I think Soham talked a lot about this earlier, with the fact that, machine learning is really buzzwordy. It's really easy to do these days with importing TensorFlow or PyTorch or something like that. And it can get you pretty good results, right? But it's not always the right solution and has a lot of pitfalls. And unless your data set is really, really big, machine learning is probably maybe not the right solution, and you should maybe just use logistic regression, to be perfectly honest. That said, another issue with machine learning I think that people face is, again, it's kind of hard to tell why certain things are happening in your model. It just happens and you're like, okay, that seems confusing, but I guess it says it's the truth. But a lot of the problems we work on, it's not just about that end value, like we talked about in the panel with the black box, but it's also about understanding why things happen. And so, we find it really important to make sure we are building interpretable models that are meaningful and not just giving us end values. So I'm sure Soham can also give a great answer to this because he's definitely experienced it a lot in his work.
Yeah, I'd be really quick. I mean, those are honestly great points because that is exactly what you have to do. Understand when you should use something, when you shouldn't. Sometimes you actually don't know until you try it, right? Top-down approach. And when you do know, when you already have expertise in these areas, you should try the bottom-up approach because you actually know which small types of techniques are actually the most relevant here, right? And then eventually you'll just kind of understand through experience what to do. Making things interpretable, though, I think that is the largest area that I think if you don't have game knowledge, you should try to get it, either through playing or talking with coaches, just understanding the game mechanics. But you don't need it to be a good esports data scientist initially in terms of doing that analysis. But in terms of being that creative, right, being a good to a great, that transition, infusing yourself with game knowledge, either whether it's through playing yourself, you don't have to be a professional or semi-professional, but playing, just understanding what do I find annoying when I hop in a game, right? Even that question is a step towards being a better data scientist. And I think that eventually will help you, again, chip away at that black box, because if I use a neural network, for example, I have no idea what just happened, but I can go back to these other techniques to help me understand what are the driving factors of this objective I've defined, let's say getting a round win or the first kill, right? And that I'm always going back to the basics whenever I get a weird answer, because that is what the most important thing is. You got to be able to interpret it. So there we go.
Cool. Thanks, Soham. So I think we're out of time, but I just want to say thank you to everyone. Lots of really good questions. and it was really exciting to share some of the work we've been doing behind the scenes. And so thanks to all of you. You know, if you have more questions, our emails are here. So, you know, you can email us, you can follow us on Twitter. We both post stupid things sometimes. Maybe sometimes we post cool data things. And in the future, I know we got a lot of questions about this too. You know, we do hope to make more and more of this public and allow people to see more behind the curtain of the data we're working on. And so, you know, stay tuned for some things in the next few months relating to that.
Awesome. So yeah, please guys, keep an eye out for updates on this and for future events. I know we got some really awesome feedback for this, and we're really happy to hold hopefully another one of these in the future. Just a couple things for people actually in university programs. We'll ask you to fill out this form because the school that has the most attendees here will win a League of Legends VOD review coaching workshop with Kelsey Moser. I know she's got a really great insight into the mind, and if you're interested in a lot of this analytics that Soham did, I'm sure she can offer some great insight as well. Additionally, if you're interested in being someone like me or Sean, an intern at EG, our internship applications are officially open. They actually opened earlier today. So check out the Discord server for more announcements regarding that. I know Sean's also posting the link in the chat. And finally, if you're looking to, you know, improve your resume, touch up on some stuff, get those professional opportunities, we do hold networking nights to sort of talk with other people involved in data and tech or other industries and get your resume reviewed, stuff like that. We'll be holding one at 6 p.m. PT tonight. So hope you guys come to those. Thank you guys so much for this event. And we really appreciate it. Again, thank you so much.